The first ships arrived just after midnight. They didn't announce themselves, didn't send a message, didn't hover in the skies for days like in the movies. No. They came fast, streaking down like silent meteors, landing in the outskirts of major cities across the world. The invasion began before anyone even realized what was happening. At first, the world froze. No one knew if they were here to communicate, to trade, or to destroy. But when the power grids failed, the satellites went dark, and military bases reported strange, shifting figures moving through the night, it became clear this wasn't a visit. It was a takeover. The invaders were unlike anything anyone had imagined. Not towering reptilian warlords, not clunky machines, marching through the streets. They were precise, cold, efficient. Their weapons were sleek, advanced beyond anything humans had ever seen, yet eerily silent. Cities fell within hours, governments crumbled, and the world seemed on the brink of being lost without a fight. But then humanity fought back. It wasn't the armies that turned the tide, not at first. The invaders had studied Earth's defenses, predicted every counterattack, neutralized every major force before it could even mobilize. But they had made a fatal mistake. They had assumed that humanity's greatest strength was its weapons. They were wrong. The first real resistance didn't come from high-tech fighter jets or armored divisions. It came from the streets, from ordinary people who refused to kneel. They fought in ways the invaders hadn't anticipated. They sabotaged, they adapted, they turned every weakness into an opportunity. They fought not like soldiers, but like survivors. The aliens had come expecting a structured war. Instead, they got chaos. In a small city on the edge of a fallen country, a handful of survivors gathered in the ruins of an old underground metro station. Among them were people from every background: doctors, engineers, construction workers, even a teenager who had learned how to rewire drones from his father's garage. They had no military training, no high-tech weapons. But they had something else. They had each other. One of them, a man with a deep scar running down his arm, leaned against the wall, listening. "They're moving fast," he murmured, glancing at the woman beside him, who had been a history professor before the world collapsed. "They don't know how to deal with an enemy that won't fight them the way they expect." She nodded, her fingers tightening around a rusted pipe. "They've never faced anything like us before." Outside, the sky burned with the eerie glow of alien warships. The invaders weren't worried. They had taken Earth's leaders, shut down its defenses, and broken its armies. They thought the fight was over. They had no idea that for humanity, the fight was only just beginning. The silence outside was deceiving. The streets were empty, the wind carrying only the distant hum of alien patrols moving through the ruins. But inside the underground metro station, tension sat heavy in the air. The group huddled around a dim lantern, their faces flickering in the weak light. The man with the scar, no one knew his real name, and no one asked, stood with his arms crossed, eyes scanning the gathered survivors. "They think they've won," he said, his voice steady but low. "They don't understand what they've walked into." The history professor, the woman clutching the rusted pipe, shifted her weight. "What do you mean?" Scar glanced toward the ceiling, as if he could see straight through the layers of concrete and into the alien-controlled city above them. "They came here expecting to conquer. But conquest isn't just about taking land or shutting down defenses. It's about control. And you can't control something you don't understand." The teenager, a wiry kid who had barely spoken since arriving at the station, looked up. "You think they don't understand us?" Scar smirked, but there was no humor in it. "No, they don't. They shut down our governments, took out the military, and assumed that was enough. They don't realize that humans don't need orders to fight. We don't wait for permission. We don't surrender just because someone tells us to." The professor exhaled, shaking her head. "They've studied us. They must have. You don't invade a planet without understanding who you're dealing with." Scar nodded. "Yeah. They studied our technology, our weapons, our history of war. But what they didn't study was the thing that matters most." The room went quiet, everyone waiting for him to explain. Scar's eyes flickered with something hard, something unshakable. They didn't study how we survive. For a long moment, no one spoke. Outside, the sound of an alien drone passed overhead, its eerie mechanical whir fading into the distance. The survivors had learned to recognize that sound. It meant someone, somewhere, was being hunted. The professor sat down slowly, running a hand over her face. So what do we do? Scar leaned forward, resting his hands on the old, dust-covered table between them. We hit them where they're weakest. They're fast, but they don't improvise. They don't adapt like we do. That's their flaw. They rely on control, on perfect execution. They don't know what to do when things go wrong. The teenager's eyes narrowed. So we make things go wrong. Scar nodded. Exactly. The group exchanged uneasy glances. It was one thing to talk about fighting back. It was another to do it. But what choice did they have? The invaders weren't leaving. They weren't negotiating. They were tightening their grip, and soon there wouldn't be any places left to hide. The professor frowned. We don't have weapons. Scar tapped the side of his head. Doesn't matter. We have our minds. That's what they're not ready for. Another silence fell, but this one was different. It wasn't fear, it was determination. The survivors weren't soldiers. They weren't trained for war. But they had something the invaders didn't. They had nothing left to lose. Far above them, in the towering wreckage of the once thriving city, the invaders moved through the streets in formation, their metallic forms gleaming under the cold glow of their ships. They moved with purpose, confident, unchallenged. They had no idea that, beneath their feet, in the forgotten tunnels of a broken world, humanity was about to remind them why Earth had never been conquered before, and why it never would be. The first mistake the invaders made was assuming the city was already theirs. Their patrols moved in rigid formations, their machines scanning for movement, searching for pockets of resistance. But the problem wasn't finding humans. It was stopping them. Every street, every alley, every abandoned building had become a battleground in ways they couldn't predict. The invaders controlled the skies, the infrastructure, the technology, but none of that mattered when the enemy was invisible, striking from the shadows, slipping away before a response could even be formed. In the underground station, Scar and the others had been watching, waiting. And now, the time had come. He crouched near the exit, listening. The patrols were on a schedule, passing the same intersections every 20 minutes, moving in predictable patterns. It was the kind of efficiency that worked against an organized military. Against humanity, it was a weakness. The professor knelt beside him. You sure about this? She whispered. Scar nodded. They think we're scattered, afraid. They're wrong. The moment we start hitting back, they'll react. And when they do, we'll learn more about them than they ever learned about us. The teenager adjusted the makeshift device in his hands, a repurposed drone, its original civilian programming stripped away, its tiny frame now carrying something far more dangerous. They rely on their tech, he murmured. Let's see how they feel when it turns against them. Scar gave him a nod. Let it fly. The small drone whirred to life, slipping out into the night air, weaving between rubble and shattered buildings. The aliens wouldn't notice it, not yet. It was too small, too insignificant. That was the beauty of it. Minutes passed in silence. Then, a sharp explosion tore through the streets above, followed by the sound of alien weapons discharging in every direction. Scar grinned. They took the bait. But the professor wasn't smiling. She was watching the city, watching the way the enemy responded. They're not running blind, she muttered. They're adjusting. Sure enough, the aliens weren't panicking. Their formations tightened, their machines reconfigured, their patrol routes changed within seconds. Whatever these creatures were, they weren't slow learners. Scar clenched his jaw. Then we hit harder. Before the words had even left his mouth, a distant sound echoed through the tunnels, a deep, rhythmic thudding, growing louder with each passing second. The survivors turned, exchanging uneasy glances. The professor's voice was barely a whisper. What is that? Scar didn't answer. He didn't need to. They all knew. The invaders had figured out where they were. And they were coming. The ground trembled beneath them. Dust rained down from the cracks in the ceiling, the old tunnels groaning as something massive moved above. The rhythmic thudding grew closer, heavier. Scar tightened his grip on his weapon, a rusted pipe, the only thing that had kept him alive more times than he cared to count. The professor's knuckles had gone white around hers. The teenager swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the tunnel exit. "They're sending something big," the professor whispered. Scar nodded, his mind already racing through the possibilities. The aliens had ignored the tunnels until now, dismissing them as relics of a forgotten infrastructure. But that had changed. They weren't playing defense anymore. They were hunting. A faint mechanical whine cut through the air. Then another. A cold realization settled over them. It wasn't just one machine. It was a whole squad. Scar moved first, signaling the others to retreat deeper into the tunnels. They couldn't stay here. If the invaders had sent something designed for close-quarters combat, they wouldn't last long. The teenager hesitated. What if we... A sharp noise ripped through the underground. Not an explosion. Not a gunshot. Something worse. A metallic screech. The sound of something shifting, unfolding, adapting. Scar spun toward the tunnel entrance just as the first shadow stretched across the wall. It was tall. Too tall. Its limbs didn't move like they should. Smooth. Precise. Almost liquid. Then came the glow faint, pulsing blue lines, tracing its form, as if scanning the space, searching for something. No, Scar thought. Not searching. Tracking. The professor exhaled sharply. We have to move. Now. But the creature had already locked onto them. The air grew thick, charged with something unnatural. Scar felt it in his bones, in the back of his skull a pressure, a presence that didn't belong here. The machine stepped forward, its body shifting as it calculated the terrain, adjusting its stance. Scar knew, without a doubt, that running wouldn't save them. This thing wasn't just built for war. It was built to end fights before they started. Another screech tore through the tunnels, and in that instant, the survivors knew this wasn't just another patrol. This was a response. The invaders weren't just reacting anymore. They were adapting. Scar didn't breathe. None of them did. The machine stood at the tunnel's mouth, its towering frame barely fitting inside. Its glowing blue lines pulsed, scanning, calculating. It had no face, no features, just a shifting mass of metal and light, moving with an eerie smoothness. It wasn't just hunting. It was learning. The teenager clenched his fists. We can't fight that. Scar's mind raced. Running wouldn't work. Hiding wouldn't work. This thing had been sent for a reason. The aliens were done flushing humans out with brute force. Now they were studying, adapting, changing their tactics. The machine took another step forward, its limbs shifting as if deciding how to move in such a confined space. The glow along its body grew stronger, the air vibrating around it. Scar gritted his teeth. We need to... A sudden, violent tremor cut him off. The tunnel walls groaned, dust spilling from the ceiling. Then came a deep, resonating boom from somewhere above. The machine froze. Another boom. Closer this time. The ground trembled. The blue lines across the creature's body flickered. For the first time, it hesitated. Scar exchanged a glance with the professor. That's not us. The machine turned its head slightly like it was listening. Then, without warning, it twisted, sprinting back toward the entrance with unnatural speed. Scar's breath caught. It's retreating? The teenager's eyes widened. Why is it leaving? Scar didn't answer. His gut told him whatever was coming next was worse. Then the third boom shook the tunnel, harder than before. This time, the walls cracked. A rush of hot, stale air surged through the underground, carrying the scent of something burnt, something metallic. Scar's pulse pounded in his ears. The invaders had sent their machine to kill them. but something out there had scared it away. And whatever it was getting closer. The tunnel groaned, the walls cracking under the force of whatever was approaching. The heat in the air grew heavier, pressing down on them. Scar wiped sweat from his brow, every instinct screaming at him to move, but his legs refused. The machine had been terrifying, but something had just sent it running. Then, from deep in the tunnel ahead, a shape emerged. It wasn't like the invaders. It wasn't smooth, polished metal. It was rough, jagged, covered in overlapping plates that looked grown rather than built. Its movement was different, too less calculated, more primal. Scar's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't one of theirs. It wasn't human, but it wasn't Dominion either. The thing stepped forward, its eyes, if they were eyes, glowing like molten embers. It turned its head slightly, as if sniffing the air, then let out a sound that sent a deep vibration through the tunnel walls. Scar's grip tightened on his weapon. He didn't know what this was, but he knew one thing: it had just changed everything. The professor took a slow step back. "We need to leave. Now." But before they could move, the creature let out a deep, guttural sound, something between a growl and a voice, low and ancient. Scar felt the weight of its gaze. Then it spoke. "You were never the real war." The words hit like a hammer, cold and final. Scar's pulse pounded. What does that mean? The creature turned its head slightly, as if listening to something they couldn't hear. Then it took another step forward. "Your enemy is afraid. That is why they run." The professor swallowed hard. Afraid of what? The creature didn't answer. It simply looked past them, toward the surface, where the alien machines had fled. Then it whispered one last thing, so quiet that Scar almost missed it. They were only the first wave. And then the tunnel collapsed. The tunnel groaned, a deep, echoing crack splitting through the walls. Dust and stone rained down as Scar's instincts finally kicked in. He grabbed the professor's arm, yanking her back just as the ceiling caved in, sealing the path where the creature had stood only moments ago. The teenager stumbled, coughing against the thick air, his eyes wide with panic. For a long moment, silence hung over them. No more tremors. No more strange sounds. Just the slow settling of debris. Scar's heart pounded. Did that just happen? The professor pressed a hand against the tunnel wall, steadying herself. Her face was pale, her mind still racing through what they had just heard. It wasn't Dominion tech. It wasn't one of ours. She looked toward the blocked passage. And it knew something we didn't. Scar exhaled sharply. He didn't know what was more terrifying, the fact that something had scared the invaders enough to make them retreat, or that whatever it was, it had warned them. The teenager rubbed his temples, trying to piece it together. "First wave," he muttered under his breath. The words echoed in his head like a curse. The Dominion had come with overwhelming force, burning entire cities to the ground, wiping out anything that stood in their way. Humanity had barely survived. And yet, that thing the creature had spoken, like they weren't even the real fight. The professor met his gaze. "We need to get back to the surface. If what it said is true, then we're not just fighting for survival anymore. We're standing between something even worse." Scar didn't argue. He turned, leading them back the way they had come, his mind replaying every detail. What had the invaders seen? What could make a species that had dominated entire worlds suddenly fear what was coming? They climbed the old maintenance ladder, the rusted metal groaning under their weight. When they finally emerged into the open air, the city was eerily quiet. No more drone patrols. No distant echoes of battle. The Dominion was gone. Scar scanned the ruined skyline. Fires still smoldered. Buildings stood like hollowed-out skeletons, silent and broken. He had expected resistance, some sign of lingering occupation. Instead, there was nothing but emptiness. The professor stepped forward, adjusting her cracked glasses. "They didn't just retreat," she murmured. "They abandoned the field." Scar didn't like the way that sounded. The Dominion never just left. They conquered. They controlled. They crushed opposition with relentless precision. But this was something else. A distant explosion suddenly lit up the horizon, far beyond the city limits. It wasn't Dominion tech, it was something new, something unfamiliar. The professor's expression hardened. They weren't running from us. Scar swallowed. His grip tightened on the rusted pipe still clutched in his hands. He had spent every waking moment since the invasion fighting to stay alive, believing that if humanity just held on long enough, they could find a way to win. But now, standing in the eerie silence of a battlefield abandoned by their enemy, he realized the war wasn't over. It was just beginning. And whatever was coming next, it was worse.